Right, so this is the second and final interviewing and advising session before you actually have your mock. It's a bit of a frightening thought. And this will be your opportunity today to actually practice the skill that we've looked at last week in terms of the guide. What I would suggest you do is, if you haven't already, make sure that you are very familiar with the guide in the chapter. So that when it comes to today and the actual mock and real assessment, that you're using the guide, the skeleton of the guide, as very much an aid memoir, so that you're so familiar with it, you know what's happening and know what's supposed to be happening next. So what we'll cover this afternoon is you actually playing the role of client and solicitor during the course of today. So you're going to get familiar with identifying the key issues in a client scenario and using that to plan and conduct the interview. So in terms of deciding what questions to ask and what advice you're going to give to the client. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. In terms of deciding what questions to ask, in addition to obviously the overview, in advance you will have received the legal notes. So as part of your preparation for this SGS, you have 2 legal notes to have a look at. And you'll develop the skill of being able to analyse the legal note to use that to your advantage in anticipating what sort of questions you're going to need to ask in order to get information from the client that's going to be relevant to the advice. There are quite a lot of additional resources on the VLE that you'll be able to have a look at to give you some assistance. I think what students particularly struggle with is, in respect of the advice, the options available. So the additional scenarios and the demonstration interviews help with that in terms of being able to think, well, what kind of problem is this and what kind of shape should the advice and the options that I'm giving take. And finally, as part of the initial bit, we'll be looking at what the key parts of the skill are and how they're going to be assessed. So a bit of a review of the guide that we looked at last week. Okay. So for today's purposes, I'm just going to review the key parts of the skill. Then you'll go into a role play. So I'll hand out to half of you the one scenario called Role Play A, which is a client called Robin Fletcher. And that will be the legal note about the breach of contract with damages, the VAT and the Sale of Goods Act. And then, so one student will play the client, one will be the advisor, solicitor advisor. At the end of the 20 minutes, you will be given an opportunity to give each other feedback, the client and the solicitor. So during the course of the actual interview, if you as the client can be making notes about feedback in relation to the guide, and then we'll all come together and have a discussion about how it went and how perhaps the questions could have gone and what advice you could have given. All right. We'll then swap over and, you'll play the solicitor or client, whichever one. We'll do exactly the same thing again. I'll give you a mock assessment briefing. I'm going to hand out a mock assessment sheet which sets out the areas of law that the legal note's going to cover. There's only 2 scenarios that are available in the mock, so you'll be assigned one or other of them. And then we'll talk a bit about the assessment and if you've got any questions. Obviously, if you've got any questions at all, you can always contact me and ask me. Yeah.
When is the mock?
The mock is the week beginning the 27th of February.
But is it on the Monday or the...
It'll be on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday.
Oh, so you can be made to come in on Tuesday?
Might. That's
when will we
possibility.
know the date?
That should be made available to you on the 30th. Oh, next week. Yeah, the week beginning 30th February. But if there's any change to that, I'll let you know. Okay.
Is it going to be exactly as the assessment? So we can have to...
No, the mock assessment I'll tell you about at the end. You're going to do that in pairs, and one of you will play the client and one of you will play the solicitor, and then you'll swap swap over.
So the real exam could also be a Tuesday.
The assessment is in the week beginning the 13th of March, and I don't know the timetable yet, I'm afraid. No. But well, speak to me at the end, and we'll have a chat about that. All right. Right, just having a look over the guide again. So as I said last week, I don't know if I said this last week, but I'm going to say it again in case. Do make sure that you're familiar with the guide and that you know where you're headed in terms of the structure of the interview. There are, it's easy to learn the introduction and the conclusion, so look at the demonstration interview and make sure you've got that off pat. But the critical areas are really questioning and advising, so we're going to be focusing in on that this afternoon so that you're absolutely clear about that. So in terms of questioning, what's going to determine what sort of questions you're going to ask, you really need to focus on the client's concerns. At what point during the interview do you get to find out what the client's concerns are?
Overview?
Yeah, so at the end of the overview, the client will always tell you about their concerns. So don't be tempted to jump in too quickly when you think they've finished telling. I mean, they'll carry on and tell you their concerns, but you're really waiting for those concerns to come up. The problem is that until you get to that point, you're a little bit in the dark about exactly what they want advice on in terms of what's worrying them or what their main concerns are. So I think that's where the scribbling down every single piece of information the client tells you comes in. But try and avoid doing that if you can, in terms of you're not taking down a verbatim note. You're supposed to be, noting down the important pieces of information. It's not easy to do that when you're not quite sure what their concerns are. I understand that. In the actual assessment, your notes are taken in and form part of the assessment. And, I've seen incredibly scant notes. A couple of them just thinking, wow, didn't really note down hardly anything. And then, a verbatim note. So you really need to be somewhere in the middle of both of those. And do try and use the split page idea, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute. So you need to use your overview note to then determine what questions you're going to ask in that sort of tight time frame. And what we're trying to suggest you do is be as structured as you can in respect of the questions that you ask. So rather than it being a bit of a random scattergun, asking any questions that sort of have popped into your head, try and be quite structured in the way that you do that and thorough, so that you have asked all the questions you think you are going to need the answers to in order to be able to properly advise. So you'll have prepared in advance with your legal note and identified potential questions as well, some of which may have already been answered in the overview. So don't start to advise too early. As we said last week, sometimes students suddenly think, as they start advising, oh, I should have asked that particular, critical piece of information. So one way of sort of avoiding that would be to, at the end of the overview, recap with the client just to check in that you're clear about certain facts. So buy yourself a bit of thinking time, and so that you can then make sure that you've got everything that you need before you start to advise. And the chapter does recommend that as well. So you don't want to recap in the extent that you're asking questions that you already know the answer to, or ask them to repeat those, but just buy yourself a little bit of time, of thinking time. In terms of the actual advising, thinking on your feet, what's the main client objective that you've sort of managed to get out of what they told you? What's their end result that they want to achieve? And then what are their concerns that you're going to then need to address in terms of the legal problem? So what do you need to do first before you start setting out clients' options? What does the guide tell you need to do?
Set out their legal position.
Yeah, so you need to explain their legal rights. So set out what the law, because the law may say, yes, you've got an action, or yes, you're entitled to claim something or do something, but the client may not want to do that. They still need to know what their position is, and you can explain that as well. And are we using any legal jargon here? No. So again, using your legal note in advance to try to practice explaining the law simply and clearly to a lay client. You then need to outline your client's options, setting out the advantages and disadvantages. Now, the options are always really tricky, and students really struggle with identifying an appropriate option, let alone then setting out the advantages and disadvantages. So you'll get to practice that this afternoon and get a feel for it, and having seen a couple of scenarios, see how we suggest you set out your options. Different scenarios are going to lend themselves to different sorts of options. So this afternoon the scenarios aren't BLP ones. They're a bit more like the demonstration interview, a little bit, not exactly like that. But a BLP scenario, which you're much more likely to get you will get in the mock, and you're much more likely to get in the actual assessment, might require a consideration of different types of options. One example being, if you suggest that negotiations take place, you might want to go into a bit more detail about what types of negotiations and what outcomes they might want to achieve, rather than it being a litigation or negotiation or don't do anything type options. It'll all become clear when you actually start doing this. It's a bit difficult to set out in abstract. With PLP, some of those might involve a potential litigation type dispute, where there'd be a formal legal process to follow. So depends on the scenario you get, what type of options you might want to set out. And what do you do at the end of the options? What do you suggest to the client?
Ask them if they can make a decision here or now.
Matt, correct, yes. So you don't make a decision for them. You don't tell them what to do. You might think that there is a particular steer, a good course of action to take, but you must let the client decide and encourage them to make a decision. Let's see if they want to make a decision there and then. Okay. Any questions back to that so far? Right, so this afternoon we are going to split you up into clients and solicitors. So if you're the client, when I hand out your scenario, read the document. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Obviously, you're going to be completely unfamiliar with it today. It's the first time you're going to have read it. So there are going to be certain questions that your solicitor has to be very precise about asking before you're going to give them the information. So only give any additional information if you are specifically asked for it. And the scenario will give you guidance about that. There's certain notes that will say, do not give the solicitor this if they ask for this, okay? So this is to do with documents particularly. What do you do if you are successful and are given a document by your client?
Read it then and there.
Read it, yes. What don't you do with it?
Write on it.
Sorry?
Write on it.
Write on it. No, the students in assessments have written on documents in the past, and you take a bit of a shock and take a breath. They've just written on someone's will or their conveyance. So try not to write on it, because that is not a very good idea. And then if you're the client, just make sure that you note feedback points for your solicitor, so that when they're going through it, think, oh yes, I'll just remind them about that. We're all supportive here. We all want each other to pass the assessment, don't we? So don't feel shy about Be positive, be constructive, but do point out where there are errors. Just a point about the actual mock. You will get the scenario of the client you're playing to print out. Do make sure that you read that and are familiar with it for the mock, because it's obviously going to assist your solicitor student, because you're going to know what questions you can and can't answer. So as a courtesy, professional courtesy to the person you're paired up with, if you can make sure that you do that. You don't need to memorise it. You don't need to do your Oscar-winning performance. You just need to read it out. That's fine.
So in the mock, we're not doing the same scenario, are we? Or are we?
That would be an error. No, you're not. No, you're going to do something you haven't seen before.
Right, okay.
So sorry, in the mock we could either be the client or the solicitor.
No, I'll talk to you about the mock later.
Right.
Let's just deal with this now.
No, we're both.
But I was just saying, for the mock, you will get the scenario in advance, all of you, with the clients you're playing, and just make sure that you're familiar with it and that you don't suddenly pick it up on the morning, because it's important you understand it. Solicitors, you can only use your unannotated legal note. That's the same for this afternoon and for, well, no, if you've written notes on it, I'll let you off this afternoon. But for the actual assessment, you will only get a clean copy of the legal note and the guide.
Can we, underline?
For the purposes of this afternoon, I'm prepared to make a concession. Yes, you can use your annotated legal note. You've got to use the guide and make sure that you take a good note of your client's explanation, the overview, and the answers that they provide, so that you can then move on to advise. Okay, I am now going to hand out the Robin Fletcher scenario. How many have we got? 2, 4, 6. Hold on. 2, 4, 6, 8, 12. We have got even numbers. Excellent. Right, that's great.